Welcome to the Louder Than Silence podcast with your host, C.G. Wagner. This podcast is an extension of our work at LTS to support survivors of sexual violence with long-term care, community, and resources, all at no cost to participants. This month's episode is Safe Relationships, Part 2. A few years ago, I was very excited about planting some dinosaur kale in my garden. I had never grown it before, and it is my favorite kind of leafy green. I planned it all out, prepped the soil, and planted the seeds. They grew and were magnificent and incredibly delicious. Over the course of about 2 months, they became these hardy, healthy plants that I had assumed would last through the winter. What I didn't know was that Texas has two separate caterpillar seasons, one in the spring and one in the fall. I thought planting in the fall meant that my plants would be safe from the majority of pests as we went into the winter. So one day I went out to check on my plants, and there were holes in a few of the leaves, but I didn't think much of it. I didn't see any insects, and I thought that some desperate bugs made an attempt and then moved on. About a week later, when I went to water my garden, all of my kale was eaten down to the ribs. There were no leaves left at all. This is when I discovered the second caterpillar season, as I lost my entire crop of kale for the winter. What should have lasted me for about 6 months ended up being only about 2.5. I was heartbroken and frustrated. I stripped off the destroyed leaves, hoping that the stalks would be able to regrow before the frost killed them. I then spent each day on the hunt for caterpillars. Apparently, this kind likes to hang out on the underside of leaves, so I had to look under each and every leaf to vanquish my tiny little foes. A few days later, I was on the phone sharing this experience with someone close to me. I felt so discouraged and sad that something I worked this hard on was gone. But this person's response was to tell me that God feeds caterpillars too, and why did I think my garden should be special? So then I got to add being hurt and angry to the mix too. Instead of this person hearing that my frustration was about more than some vegetables, they dismissed me and my feelings about having lost something I loved and worked hard to have. Throwing some answer about God at me didn't leave me feeling consoled or hopeful about the future. It left me feeling more disconnected from this person on top of what I was already navigating. And it was never repaired. When I brought it up in the future, the challenge I got in response was whether or not I believed that God was in control of everything. Instead of recognizing the hurt I was feeling, even more distance was created between us. Now, in the grand scheme, it was one of the more minor offenses that people have committed against me. After all, I started Louder Than Silence because I am a multiple time and multiple perpetrator survivor of sexual violence. Careless words are many magnitudes more shallow than the wounds of sexual violence. But they're still wounds, nonetheless. Ones that I was told didn't matter and that repair wouldn't happen. I walked a long road of forgiveness in my life. This was one of the easier moments to let go of and hold on to forgiveness. And even so, this seemingly simple and small interaction left an impression in my life and a layer of distance between myself and the person who said it. We've all had damage done. Some of the damage is enormous and life-shattering. Some damage is paper cuts, annoyances, and not much else. And then there's everything in between. And working through all of this feels like such a mess sometimes. Today, we are talking about relational health in our Survivors Have Paid Enough series. This is episode 9 of the series, where we explore 8 areas of health and dive into how survivors of sexual violence have all areas of their lives impacted by the trauma they've experienced. We also learn about ways to improve these areas of health and see life transformations that we want. We started this series by exploring how mental health is affected by sexual violence and taking a very deep dive into PTSD. We then began unpacking emotional health and what it looks like to feel big emotions and practice good emotional hygiene. Now, last month, we started the conversation about relationship health and how to identify safe relationships. For this episode, we are continuing our exploration of relationship health, specifically setting boundaries and identifying some things that get in the way of connecting well with others. Now, to start, I want to address the very common assumption that if our relationships aren't going the way that we want, then the problem is like out there, so to speak. That is to say that the problem is with the other people in our lives. I want to make sure that we are focusing on what is really important here, which is understanding ourselves and how we interact with others. Remember, we cannot change someone else's behaviors. We can only change our behaviors and responses to others. So, if something is happening between you and someone else that you don't like, you cannot change how the other person or people choose to behave. You can only impact how you show up and interact with them. This is the foundational idea of setting boundaries. We violate our own and other people's boundaries when we try to control someone or something other than ourselves. When we set boundaries, if the intent is to change someone else, then we are violating their boundaries, their autonomy as humans. Setting boundaries is simply saying, this is how I will respond to these types of situations. No more, no less. Of course, for people we are close to, it is important to express when they are doing something that hurts us or even something that we would simply like to see go differently. That is sharing yourself with another person and is a way to build connection. But the way they choose to incorporate that information is up to them. Even though it may hurt more, they are totally allowed to ignore our feedback. That will cause damage to the relationship, and then you get to decide what to do with that. But that is their decision to make. Now, I hear some of you saying that you don't get it. I'm going to give you an example. Say a friend shares information that you told them in confidence, and then you find out. Naturally, it hurts your feelings that they betrayed your trust. A healthy way to set a boundary is to go to them and tell them that what they did hurt you. If they apologize and repair the damage done, then everyone can move on. If they dismiss your concerns, blame shift, or get defensive about their own damaging behavior, then a boundary might be that you decide you will no longer share information with them that you wouldn't be fine with everyone knowing. But crossing their boundary would potentially look like telling a bunch of people about how they betrayed your trust instead of just going to them about it. Or maybe it looks like doing something similar to them, sharing their personal information with others so they know how you feel. Or becoming emotionally withholding without explaining what happened to cause the break between you. All of these things are trying to control their behavior instead of controlling yours. So if we know that we can only control our own actions, what are some areas that you are able to impact that might be getting in the way of your relationships? Well, first and foremost, for this conversation, we are discussing it through the lens of being a survivor of sexual violence. So it is natural, normal, and needed to withdraw during the healing process. This is because in order to survive traumatic events, we have to disconnect in order to live through it. We disconnect from ourselves, from others, and from the world around us so that the devastation we experience doesn't end us. And as we rebuild, we are learning how to reconnect. We learn how to trust ourselves, to recognize when others are safe or not. We learn how to hear what our bodies and souls are telling us that they need. Until we can connect better with ourselves, there is a barrier between ourselves and other people. The healthy relationship we want with other people is predicated on our ability to have a healthy relationship with ourselves. I say this time and time again when I talk about this work. The better you know yourself, the better your conversations will go. Each interaction where you can bring more and more of yourself, have clarity about what you bring to the table, and know your boundaries, the better it will go. That being said, when we decide to change, it is a challenge. We know this. Even with positive change, there's friction. We get a new job, start a new romantic relationship, move to a new apartment. It's positive, but there's still some friction that bubbles up around it. When we make changes in ourselves, connect more, speak up for ourselves, and set boundaries, it is a healthy and beautiful thing. But it also creates friction in the people around us. See, their lives are changing too, but they didn't choose the change. You did. And that's fine. It is up to them to navigate these changes, communicate well, and both of you to work on moving forward together. All that to say, there will likely be some friction in your relationships as you identify things that get in the way of you connecting with others and change those patterns within yourself. You will have conversations that don't feel good or feel like maybe even causing more problems. It may be difficult to believe that this is the change you want for yourself. You may say, CG said things would go better, and they aren't. But remember that things going better looks like each person being able to have equal weight in a conversation and share the parts of themselves they want to share. If you've been withholding part of yourself as protection, it will feel unnatural to change that. But any interaction where you are expressing your real, true self in a healthy, kind, and loving way is a better interaction. It just may not feel like it in that exact moment. And now that we've covered that, let's look at some of our ingrained patterns, beliefs, behaviors that create distance between ourselves and other people. First and foremost, for this community, unaddressed damage will be the primary wall that gets between us and other people. When we haven't addressed the trauma or the wounds we've experienced, it shrinks our window of tolerance. We simply aren't able to have as much space for other people as we would like. When our bodies and brains are constantly on the search for how we will be harmed again, we can't relax into the situation in front of us. And when I say how we will be harmed again, it's because that's the mark trauma leaves on the brain. It is only in addressing the trauma that messages begin to quiet down and fade away so that we can see it as maybe it's an if we'll be harmed again. Beyond the general concept of unaddressed damage, there's a more specific version of that. Unaddressed damage between people. If you find that there's someone in your life that is almost impossible to get along with or even to get on the same page as, there is a very good chance that one of you or the other, or both of you, created a break in the connection between you and haven't done anything to repair it. When someone hurts us, it creates distance. If we do the work to repair the wounds and close the gap, then things can and do go back to normal. But If the person who caused the damage is unwilling or unable to repair, then our brains associate that person with feeling unsafe, with feeling danger. So if we are interacting with that person, the unaddressed damage becomes the loudest part of the conversation, simply because our brains are signaling to us that it's not safe. The brain is saying that either the conflict needs to be resolved or we need to get out of the situation entirely. The distance will remain until the repair work is done, plain and simple. As survivors, as we work on building our window of tolerance, that signal in our brain about the situation being unsafe won't be as loud or feel as intolerable. But relationally, we are not able to open up to that person in the way we once did. Repair is possible, though. And the work of repair is on the person who caused the damage. It's not on the person who was harmed. I've said this in some version many times throughout the course of the work at LTS. All of what I described a minute ago is totally separate from forgiveness. Forgiveness is forgiveness is an internal process, one where we are holding on to resentments and expectations and let them go. Repairing a relationship is external work where we hear what we did to harm the other person and take the necessary and required steps to make amends. Forgiveness is not absolution. Collectively, we need to stop telling victims that the issue is that they are being unforgiving instead of recognizing that people who caused harm haven't done what they need to do. On behalf of myself and many other survivors I know who have been told that they simply need to forgive, please stop saying it. If you feel the need to tell someone else that they have to be forgiving or forgive someone, just don't. Coercing someone into forgiveness only causes more damage and disconnection. Never once has it created a better relationship. Otherwise, a large portion of what causes disconnection between people is a difference in worldview or perspectives based on life experiences. We grow up assuming that what we were taught to believe is the correct way to be, and everyone else either believes what we believe or is bad, sinful, wrong, etc. As we mature, through looking both inward and outward, we come to understand that there are all sorts of ways to see things. For many survivors, this work is done in partnership with a therapist, something we highly recommend at LTS. And as a side note, I just want to throw into the mix that maturing is different than aging. People age, whether or not they want to. Not everyone matures. Maturing is a choice. But what feels uncomfortable about recognizing the patterns that we have that get in the way of connection is that our default approach has been ingrained for so long. Taking the time to really pause and question these things will feel off. But it is the only way to ensure we are choosing to live the way we want to live instead of unconsciously living the way other people trained us to live. One of the big things that gets in the way of connection is the prevalence of bypassing. This simply means that when something feels emotionally heavy or overwhelming, we disconnect from it mentally in order to avoid the feelings of discomfort. Think of it as a low-grade coping mechanism, if you will. Instead of practicing the emotional resilience to face the challenging feelings, we attempt to avoid them. In American culture, the two most prevalent forms of bypassing are spiritual and intellectual. Spiritual bypassing looks like turning something that is tangible and a challenge that's right in front of us into something esoteric and out of our control or reach. It deflects our ability to be present and acknowledge the weight of what's happening because we give away our autonomy to the universe, higher power, God, or whatever the name for the great mystery we use. Instead of sitting in the pain, saying, I see you and I'm here for this, we chalk it up to some grand plan or attempt to apply religious texts to the situations at hand. Personally, I've experienced people lobbing Bible verses at me instead of acknowledging my pain too many times to count. And let me tell you, that doesn't help. Intellectual bypassing is doing the same thing, avoiding uncomfortable emotions by applying intellectual rigor or information to the situation at hand. How this manifests is that someone shares something deep or personal, and the response is to talk about an article, a video, or some information connected to the thought. It unintentionally dismisses the emotional component and connecting from the heart and allows the mind to take over the interaction. And our minds simply don't know how to connect with other people as well as our hearts do. And of course, it's not possible to feel close to a person if this is how they choose to respond to moments of vulnerability. So when you feel a disconnect with someone, ask if you are using one of these bypass techniques and see how that's creating more distance between you. Then take steps to create a new strategy for that response that doesn't break connection. A close cousin to bypassing is using cliches or the phrase, I can't imagine, when responding to someone. These allow us not to engage fully on what the other person has shared while giving a semblance of connection. It's acknowledging that we heard what they said, but instead of emotionally meeting them where they are, we are still keeping our distance. So instead of throwing a que sera, sera, or everything happens for a reason at someone, how about you try to simply say, that sounds really tough. Or, I wish you didn't have to navigate such a challenging experience. These allow for further conversation. Avoiding the phrase, I can't imagine, is advice that I share with anyone who wants to listen to it. Saying I can't imagine tells a person, I won't imagine. I won't put myself in your shoes. I won't empathize. I won't allow myself to feel the depth of what the experience must have been like for you. I'm going to keep my distance from even considering the full weight of what that must have been like. It's telling the other person that what they went through isn't worth the emotional work of holding space for them. Instead, I suggest saying, I can imagine, with the part that you do understand, and then ask follow-up questions about the parts that aren't as familiar to you or you don't have experience with yourself. The example I often give is that if I'm talking to a friend who has teenage children, which I don't, and they're sharing how challenging it is, I respond with, I can't imagine raising teenagers. I mean, clearly that shuts down the conversation there. But if I respond with, I can imagine it's difficult to navigate the balance between wanting them to feel like they're able to be independent and make good decisions with wanting to protect them. What does it look like to decide whether to err on the side of independence or protection? So then I have built more connection, provided space for the emotional discomfort, and allowed myself to be open to understanding them better. Beyond these specific interpersonal disconnections, There are many barriers that get in the way on a larger scale. The cultural norms we learn become deeply embedded, no matter where they come from. This is how you can tell a person who lives in New York from a tourist. Someone who lives in Manhattan will cross the street, even if they don't have a walk sign, if no cars are coming. Tourists wait for the signal. No one sat all the New Yorkers down and explained that this is the way to be. They simply picked up the habits of those around them until it became their norm too. There are two big cultural norms that span all sorts of demographics that directly impact how we connect with each other, depending on what end of the spectrum you are with it. One is the guessing versus asking culture, and the other is the honor and shame versus the right and wrong culture. Both of these we learn from childhood, in our family units, our close communities. We often don't even know that they exist, which is how they're able to impact our relationships so much without us realizing it. There are ways of being outside of these cultures, but those are the ones that we can choose for ourselves once we understand how we want to approach the world. For the guessing versus asking culture, it is based on how information is shared. If you learn that guessing is the best approach, you learn that the onus is on the person with less information to read between the lines, make deductions, and arrive at a conclusion. The person reads context clues, behavioral patterns, and the nuance of a situation to understand what's happening. Now, asking is just that. If a person doesn't have all the information, they simply ask for it. For asking people, they don't understand why guessing people can't just be straightforward and clear. Seems like needlessly playing games instead of coming right out and saying the thing. But for guessing people, they don't get how asking people can be so blunt or even harsh. Aren't they willing to sit with nuance, take a deeper look at things? A good way forward with this is to see how you typically react when you feel like you don't have enough information. Whatever way feels more natural to you, look to see what a step towards balance between those two things might be. How can you sit with the nuance and absorb what's happening around you, and also ask for what you're not able to pick up on your own? For the honor and shame versus right and wrong culture, this is a framing for how people interact with each other, specifically around what drives people to make decisions that they do. Again, there are other ways to approach these things, but these are the common cultures that people grow up in and experience as normal. For the honor and shame culture, the context is that people should be focused on what bring more honor to themselves, their families, their workplaces, their faith communities, etc. The flip side of that, the things to be avoided, are the behaviors and decisions that bring shame to themselves, their families, etc. It is a method of making decisions based on what the community believes is the best way of being. For the right and wrong culture, the understanding is that all decisions and actions can be broken down into either right or wrong, based on a set of rules, whether self-imposed or imposed from the outside. Doing something the, quote, right way typically has a connotation of winning or receiving a prize. Doing something the, quote, wrong way means punishment or reduction of what one has to make up for the incorrect behavior. It's more individualistic in its approach to decision making. Your assumptions of how people make decisions greatly impacts the dynamics of interactions. The more we can see what drives how we are, the more we can find a middle ground. We can figure out a balance of what brings the best outcomes to the most people while reducing the amount of damage or friction as much as possible. For all of this, the hope is that we can understand ourselves better and bring a healthier version of ourselves to our relationships. Again, we can't control other people. This is truly the only way to have the type of relationships we want. And doing all this work may feel thankless at times. It may feel pointless, even. It can feel daunting or overwhelming. But working on recognizing the behaviors we bring to our relationships and working to improve them will reap many, many more benefits than we can imagine. We learn how to hold with open hands the people have hurt us, but also we've created the hurt too. We learn how to repair when we've caused damage. We walk a different path and end up in a different destination. One with beautiful, flourishing, life-giving relationships. And as we go into 2025, this is my encouragement for us. Let's look at the ways that we are getting in the way of the relationships we want for ourselves and then do something about it. Let's end 2025 being able to say that we have the strong, healthy relationships we've always wanted. I believe we can get there together. Thank you for listening to the Louder Than Silence podcast. If you'd like more information about our organization, visit us at louderthansilence.org and sign up for our newsletter or follow us on Instagram at louderthansilence.org. If you like our work, please consider donating today. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast for the most current episodes. See you next month.